August has stopped pretending to be pleasant. The air is thick and heavy, the kind of humidity that sticks to your skin and makes paper curl if you leave it out for too long. Afternoon storms come through and soak everything down. The cicadas have reached a volume that feels unreasonable. There are mosquitoes hovering over standing water, dragonflies darting through the reeds, frogs calling from somewhere you can't quite see. And every patch of shade seems alive with 1,000 small things in constant motion, feeding and being fed, living and breaking down into what comes next. The water itself is dark enough to look almost black. Cypress trees rise straight out of it, their trunks widening where they meet the flooded ground, strange knees pushing up through the mud around them. Spanish moss hangs from the branches overhead, pale gray-green against bark so dark with moisture it looks almost burned. Fallen leaves collect along the edges of the water and sink slowly beneath the surface, while branches soften, bark loosens, fungi move into dead wood. Insects tunnel through it, and the leaf litter breaks apart into dark tannin-stained water that seeps into the soil and disappears, into the same slow churn of rot and return. There is rot everywhere. Rot smells and swells and attracts flies. It softens fruit until the skin splits open. It turns fallen wood spongy beneath your fingers and sends mushrooms pushing through things that looked solid just a few days ago. It can feed an ecosystem, and it can foul water. And it can overwhelm a system faster than that system can process what has died. And yet, there is an absolutely obscene amount of life still here. That contradiction is one of the things I love about swamps. We have spent a very long time describing them as stagnant places, dead places, dangerous places, useless ground that ought to be drained or filled or made into something more productive, when the reality is that a wetland can be almost offensively busy. Water carries everything through it. Nutrients, carbon, the slow drift of dissolved life itself, while leaves fall and begin breaking apart almost as soon as they touch the surface. Bacteria and fungi and insects get to work. Life keeps going here, but the shape of life changes. Some things take a very long time to disappear. A leaf can fall from a tree and stop being a leaf without immediately ceasing to exist. A branch can die and spend years becoming something else. What was once living tissue slowly breaks down into sediment and dissolved material, feeding other forms of life, offering shelter, and eventually becoming part of the chemistry of the water itself. Death and disappearance are not the same thing. I think we know that, somewhere underneath all the cleaner stories we like to tell ourselves. We tend to prefer stories that behave themselves, stories with clear edges, where it is obvious when something has begun and when it has ended, what it was supposed to mean, and what we are meant to take from it before we are allowed to set it down and move on. But some things end and stay with us anyway. Sometimes what remains is useful. Sometimes it is beautiful. Sometimes it is neither of those things. Sometimes something that once kept a system alive becomes a problem when the conditions change. Sometimes the thing we inherited has been passed down so many times that nobody remembers exactly why it began. Sometimes a warning becomes a tradition, or a defense becomes a habit, or a story takes root so deeply that it keeps growing long after the world around it has changed. And sometimes we don't realize what is still there until something disturbs the water. That is where I want to begin this month. Not with a metaphor, although we're certainly going to find a few along the way, because apparently I am physically incapable of looking at anything vaguely symbolic without eventually having an existential crisis, of which I must then share with everyone. I want to begin by looking at the actual thing, at the water and why it is dark, at the trees and the strange structures growing around their roots, at what decomposition really does and what it doesn't, at the stories people have attached to landscapes like this, the ghosts that gather around southern porches, the blue-painted ceilings that have accumulated histories and explanations of their own, and the ways folklore changes when it passes from one person, one generation, one community, and one context into another. And then we're going to follow these roots a little deeper, because eventually the question stops being simply, where did this come from? And starts becoming something heavier, something that doesn't sit neatly in the mouth when you try to say it out loud. Eventually, we have to ask what happened after it got here. What survived the crossing? What changed shape in the dark? What kept growing because at one point it had a very good reason to, and what happens when that reason is gone, but the thing itself refuses to stop existing? That is where anger enters this conversation, not as something sudden, but as something that has been accumulating quietly in the body of it all along. And protection, too, and consequence, and curse work in the oldest sense of the word, work that binds, work that remembers, work that does not forget what it was asked to hold. Because the uncomfortable fact is that understanding the roots of something does not automatically tell us what we should do with what grew from them. Knowing where it came from does not absolve us of deciding what is now. Sometimes understanding leads to compassion. Sometimes it leads to repair. Sometimes it leads to a boundary drawn so cleanly it feels like grief. Sometimes it leads to consequence that cannot be softened by explanation. And sometimes we preserve what remains because it still has value. It still breathes in some altered way that we can recognize. And sometimes we finally admit, quietly, reluctantly, that something is already dead, even though we have spent years feeding it, tending it, speaking to it, as if it might answer us back. That is the territory between roots and reckoning, and rot lives there. Not as punishment, and certainly not as some pretty little promise that every painful thing will eventually become fertilizer for a more beautiful life. Rot is simply what happens when one form has ended and the material is still here. And rot changes things. It changes the soil and the water and what can grow next. So this month, we're going into the swamp, into the dead heat of August, into tannin dark water and cypress roots, into haints and old stories and blue ceilings, into inheritance and survival and the things we keep carrying because nobody ever stopped to ask whether we still needed them. We're going to look at what grows in dark water, and more importantly, we're going to look closely enough to ask what has been growing there all along. Welcome back to the Inner Circle. I'm Nicole Blackwater, and today we're going into the swamp to talk about roots, rot, and reckoning. What survives, what changes, and what happens when we finally look closely at what's been growing in dark water. When we call something black water, we are describing a real kind of aquatic environment, and the darkness has considerably less to do with haunted swamps than I would personally enjoy telling you. Clearly, the word itself got its hooks into me anyway, considering I eventually borrowed it for the name Blackwater Apothecary. If you've ever made a cup of tea and forgotten about it for an unreasonable amount of time, you already understand part of what is happening here. Leaves fall in slow accumulation, not as a single event, but as a constant shedding of the forest above. Bark loosens in thin, papery layers or in heavy strips that peel away over time. Twigs and branches break under wind, weight, decay, and the quiet pressure of age. Roots die back in sections, retreating from saturated soil or simply giving away as older tissues fail and are replaced. And all of those compounds stain the water. Sometimes the water is a rich amber hue, sometimes a deep reddish brown or the color of a very strong tea. And sometimes the water becomes so dark that a creek only a few feet deep can look almost black until you scoop that water into your hand and realize the darkness belongs to the water collectively, not to each individual drop. Which is so fascinating to me because the color of a blackwater swamp is partly the visible evidence of the landscape breaking itself down. The forest falls into the water, and the water carries traces of the forest with it, which sounds poetic because it is poetic, but it's also chemistry. Decomposition is one of those words that we all understand until someone asks us what exactly is decomposing anything. So a leaf falls into the water and it doesn't simply dissolve and become swamp nutrients in any immediate or uniform way. There's an entire workforce involved. Fungi begin colonizing dead plant tissue. Bacteria get to work on compounds they can metabolize. Tiny invertebrates shred and graze and consume pieces of dead material, creating smaller pieces with more surface area for microorganisms to work on. Soluble compounds leach directly into the water. Carbon moves through the microbial bodies and sediments in water, while nitrogen, phosphorus, and other nutrients change chemical form and become available, unavailable, stored, released, and then taken up again. The dead leaf becomes a process, and it's a process that can take a very long time. One of the reasons wetlands are so interesting is that water changes the rules. In ordinary, well-drained soil, there are tiny spaces between particles that contain air. When soil stays saturated, water fills those spaces instead, and oxygen moves through water much more slowly than it moves through air. Whatever oxygen is already available can also be used up pretty quickly by roots and microorganisms doing the extremely metabolically expensive business of being alive. So, below the surface, wetland soils can become oxygen poor or even anoxic, meaning there's effectively no free oxygen available at all. The organisms working there do not simply throw down their little microbial tools and go home. Different kinds of microbial metabolism become important. Different chemical reactions become possible. Decomposition continues, but some kinds of organic material break down much more slowly under these conditions, which is one reason wetlands can accumulate enormous stores of partially decomposed plant material and carbon. This is how you can end up with layer upon layer of the past still physically present in a living landscape. Roots and leaves and wood and pollen, plant tissue that entered the system years, decades, sometimes much longer ago, that have been altered beyond recognition, but they're still there. I want to be careful with the language here because there is a very tempting, very witchy version of this story where I tell you that nothing ever really dies because everything becomes nourishment and the swamp is a beautiful cycle of death and rebirth, and then we all hold hands. Ecology has absolutely no obligation to give us that satisfying of an ending. Decomposition can return nutrients to a system, and those nutrients can support other forms of life. Wetlands are extraordinarily important sites of carbon storage and nutrient cycling, and some swamp forests are astonishingly productive ecosystems. But rot can also consume oxygen. Microbial decomposition can produce methane, organic acids, and under the right chemical conditions, some truly spectacular smells. When large amounts of organic matter or excessive nutrients enter an aquatic system, microbial activity can help drive oxygen concentration so low that animals cannot survive there. In these cases, the systems can become overloaded in a way that is not immediately visible from the surface, but is profound in its effects below it. Water quality shifts as oxygen is depleted and chemical balances change, and over time, whole communities of organisms can be reorganized or replaced as species that once thrived are no longer able to persist under the new conditions. There is no universal ecological law stating that because something died, its death will become useful in exactly the right amount, in exactly the right place, at exactly the right time. Sometimes decay feeds, and sometimes it preserves, and sometimes it changes the chemistry enough that something which lived there can no longer live there at all. And sometimes the conditions created by all of this are exactly what another organism has adapted to survive. Which brings me to one of my favorite remarkable structures in the entire swamp, cypress knees. If you have never seen a bald cypress growing in standing water, the roots can produce these woody projections that rise out of the mud around the tree, sometimes only a few inches high and sometimes much larger, like knobby little stalagmites surrounding the trunk. They are connected to the tree's horizontal root system, and people have been trying to figure out exactly what the hell they are for a very long time. The explanation you will hear most often is that cypress knees help the tree breathe, which makes intuitive sense. The tree is growing in saturated soil where oxygen is limited. The roots send structures upward above the waterline. Except science had to come along and ruin the elegance of that explanation by asking whether the knees actually transport enough oxygen to aerate the root system. And the answer is we don't really know. I love this so much. There is evidence that gases can move through cypress knees, but experiments have not established that aerating the root system is their essential physiological function, and bald cypress can survive without producing prominent knees at all. Other researchers have suggested that the knees may contribute to anchoring these enormous trees in unstable, saturated soil, especially because substantial secondary root systems can develop beneath them. Their height also seems to relate to water conditions, and they are far more common in flooded environments than in dry ones. So we have an absolutely unmistakable structure that this tree spends energy building over and over and over again, sometimes hundreds of them around a single old tree. And after generations of people staring at them, cutting them open, measuring them, flooding them, depriving them of oxygen, and generally trying every method we have to understand what they do, the most responsible answer is still, we have some ideas. One of the habits I want us to practice throughout this entire episode is getting comfortable with the difference between a satisfying explanation and a supported one. We're going to run into that same problem again when we get to folklore, and again when we get to history, and again when we get to magic. There are stories people have repeated so often that they sound like facts. There are explanations that fit so beautifully that we want them to be true. Sometimes the evidence eventually supports them. Sometimes the evidence complicates them. And sometimes we have to leave a little empty space in the field notes and write, function uncertain. This doesn't make the thing something we should pass off as boring. If anything, I think this makes it so much more fascinating. When we look closely at a swamp, what appears stagnant from a distance becomes almost impossibly active. Water is moving even when we cannot see a current. Carbon is moving. Nutrients are changing form. Those little microorganisms are working in places where oxygen barely reaches. Leaves are entering the water faster than others can completely disappear. The roots are growing through material made from generations of things that lived and died in the same place. Everything is participating, including the dead. A fallen leaf no longer photosynthesizes. A branch lying beneath the water is no longer part of a living tree. The organism has ended, but its material does not simply stop existing or become irrelevant. It continues to be worked on, broken down, carried, and transformed by everything around it. It can become habitat or food, or it can settle into sediment and dissolve into the water as carbon compounds. Sometimes it is stored, sometimes it is released again as nutrients. Sometimes it becomes an obstruction in the flow of water or a site of microbial activity that changes the chemistry of its surroundings. And often it is several of these things at once, depending on where you are looking at and when. Death has happened here, but nothing has disappeared. Something can be dead and still be participating in the system. This raises an even more fascinating question. If the conditions of a place can determine what survives there, what kind of shapes does survival begin to take? Because the deeper we go into a swamp, the stranger those shapes become. The strange thing about adaptation is that we tend to talk about it after the fact. We looked at those bald cypress standing in the water, surrounded by those enormous buttressed roots and strange knees, and of course, it seems perfectly suited to being there. It grows naturally on those saturated and seasonally flooded soils, and those mature trees can tolerate conditions that would be disastrous for plenty of other tree species. But even here, survival is so much more particular than simply being good at swamps. Cypress seeds are carried by floodwater, but they cannot actually germinate while submerged. They need saturated ground that remains exposed long enough for germination to happen. And once the seedling gets started, it has to grow quickly enough to keep at least part of itself above the water. Prolonged complete submersion can kill it. The same water that distributes the seed can prevent it from germinating, and the same flooded landscape that an old cypress can occupy for centuries can drown a young one before it ever gets started. Conditions shape what survives there, but survival is never happening in some abstract category called difficult conditions. Depth, timing, age, and chemistry all matter in ways that can't be separated from one another. What would drown one plant can be ordinary habitat for another, and what an established organism survives easily may still be deadly at another stage of life. Life takes its shape in relationship with the place where it is trying to continue. And sometimes, if you are standing outside of that relationship, the shape it takes can look bizarre. And I think this becomes important when we pull our attention away from the trees for a minute and look at the way people have historically described swamps themselves. Because American history contains a truly staggering amount of literature devoted to the basic argument that wetlands would be much better if they stopped being wet. Swamps were described as stagnant, unhealthy, inaccessible, dangerous, and unproductive. Before germ theory, standing water was strongly associated with disease and bad air, which gave drainage the appearance of medical progress as well as economic progress. Wetlands interrupted roads and surveys, flooded agricultural ground, complicated property boundaries, and made transportation difficult. Land that could not be easily parceled, farmed, built upon, or crossed was routinely treated as land waiting to be improved. And the language used for that improvement is worth paying attention to. Reclamation. To reclaim a swamp meant draining it, ditching it, filling it, straightening its water courses, lowering its water table, and converting it into land that fit a particular definition of usefulness. The word itself carries a judgment. Something was being reclaimed because somebody had already decided that wet ground in its existing state was unfinished, wasted, or somehow lost. So whenever I run into the word wasteland in this history, I find myself wanting to add two more words. Useless to whom? Because landscape that is inconvenient for farming may be extraordinarily productive ecologically. A place that frustrates road building can still be traveled by someone who knows its waterways. Land that resists neat surveying and parcelization can support people whose relationship with it has very little to do with whether somebody can draw property lines across it. And a place that is difficult to enter, map, cross, drain, police, and control can become very useful indeed to someone who needs to disappear from the people trying to control them. This brings us to the Great Dismal Swamp. The Great Dismal Swamp stretches across southeastern Virginia and northeastern North Carolina, although the surviving refuge today is only a fraction of the enormous wetland that once existed there. European colonists encountered a landscape they found profoundly frustrating. In 1728, William Byrd II surveyed the boundary between Virginia and North Carolina and helped popularize the name that has stuck with it ever since, the Dismal Swamp. Even the name itself, dismal, signals the way colonists framed the landscape as undesirable, inhospitable, and in need of transformation. By the 18th century, investors were already trying to change it. George Washington and other investors formed the Dismal Swamp Company in the 1760s with plans to drain the wetland and turn that ground toward agriculture and profit. Their stated mission included draining, improving, and saving the land, which tells you quite a bit about what they thought the swamp needed saving from. Enslaved laborers dug ditches through it, and when the dream of simply draining the whole enormous thing proved less practical than hoped, timber extraction became a major source of profit instead. But while investors were trying to make the swamp more accessible, more productive, and more controllable, other people were using the very qualities they hated about it to survive beyond their control. From the late 17th century through the Civil War era, people escaping slavery sought refuge in the Great Dismal Swamp, and some remained there long enough to create communities on areas of higher ground deep within the wetland. Archaeological work by Daniel Sayers and others has helped establish that these were more than fleeting hiding places. The landscape contains evidence of long-term communities involving Maroons, indigenous people, free Black people, enslaved laborers working within the swamp economy, and others living at its margins. Marronage can include different forms and durations of escape, but when historians talk about the Maroon communities of the Great Dismal Swamp, we are talking about people creating lives outside the direct control of enslavers, sometimes for years or generations. Some moved between the swamp and the surrounding economy. Some used it as part of a route toward somewhere else. Others made homes there. The records are incomplete. The estimates of how many people live there vary enormously, and the swamp itself is one of the reasons the history can be difficult to recover. The land itself did a lot of work. Dense vegetation made visibility difficult. Water complicated movement. Areas of higher ground existed like islands within the wetland. The swamp crossed a colonial and later state boundary, and knowledge of pathways, waterways, and seasonal conditions could mean the difference between a landscape that seemed nearly impassable and one that could be navigated. The qualities that made the Great Dismal a problem for surveyors, investors, and enslavers were some of the same qualities that could create distance, concealment, and room for autonomy. I don't want to turn this history into some inspirational story about the swamp teaching us how to resist oppression. Real people lived here under extraordinarily violent material conditions. They were not symbols. The swamp did not liberate them, and survival inside it was not easy or romantic. What the landscape did was alter the possibilities available. A place that one group experienced as hostile and inaccessible could provide another group with possibilities for concealment, movement, and survival that more easily controlled ground could not. That is considerably more interesting than the fact that the very name dismal was imposed by white surveyors and investors who experienced it as hostile, unproductive, and unnavigable. Good or bad was never really the point, only whether it could be made to serve them. The same flooded ground can be an obstacle, livelihood, refuge, home, extractive frontier, and ecological abundance, depending on who is standing in it and what they're trying to do. And this brings us all back to roots. When we ask where something came from, We are never really asking for a point of origin so much as we are asking for a set of conditions, an atmosphere, a pressure system, a slow accumulation of circumstance that made a particular form not only possible, but inevitable in the way inevitability only ever looks in hindsight. A cypress tree does not simply stand in water the way we might casually say it does. It takes its shape in conversation with that water, in negotiation with it, in a long, patient argument between saturation and survival. Its roots do not behave like roots in dry ground. They spread, they brace, they rise into those strange architectures that only make sense if you understand that the ground itself is not stable, that the boundary between soil and water is not a line, but a shifting agreement. A survival strategy is no different. It is not chosen in the abstract, as if a mind were presented with a menu of options in calm conditions. It is formed under pressure, in the narrowing of possibilities, in the repeated encounter with what cannot be controlled. It accrues over time the way sediment does, layer upon layer of response, adaptation, improvisation, until what we later call strategy is really just the visible shape of having had to continue. A community's practices, too, are not inventions in the clean sense we like to imagine. They develop within particular material circumstances, the availability of land or its absence, the presence of water or its unpredictability, the proximity of danger, the possibility of movement, the constraints of labor, the permissions and prohibitions of a given world. What looks like culture from a distance is often, on closer inspection, a record of what was necessary in order to remain. And so, stories, habits, defenses, traditions, the things we tend to treat as if they arrived fully formed, as if they floated in from somewhere outside of time, do not appear out of nowhere. They grow. They take shape slowly, sometimes almost imperceptibly, in response to the environments that hold them. They are not separate from those environments. They are what those environments become when lived in long enough, when survived through carefully enough, when passed from one body to another until survival itself begins to resemble meaning. Understanding those conditions can tell us an enormous amount about why something exists, the way a particular shape of life or habit or structure becomes not just possible, but almost inevitable under a certain set of pressures. But roots can only take us so far, because eventually conditions change. The flood recedes and the danger moves. The world around a thing becomes different from the world in which it first learned how to survive. And yet the shape it made in response to that earlier world does not simply disappear. And then we have to ask what happens when the old shape remains. If we are going to talk about old shapes remaining after the world around them has changed, there is probably no better place to look next than folklore. Stories are remarkably good at surviving. They move from one person to another, through families and communities, across county lines and state lines, sometimes through migration and sometimes through people simply sitting on a porch telling each other what happened here before either of them were born. They pick up details and lose others. A word changes pronunciation. An explanation gets attached to a practice that may be older than the explanation itself. Something somebody's grandmother did because her grandmother did it becomes a tradition. And eventually, somebody comes along and asks the question that is causing us so much trouble throughout this entire episode. Where did this actually come from? Which brings me to haints. The word haint is wonderfully evocative. It has become so strongly associated with certain kinds of Southern ghost stories. You will sometimes see explanations online that describe haint as a Gullah or Gullah Geechee word for ghost. The available linguistic evidence does not clearly support that interpretation. Haint is a regional form of haunt, specifically the noun sense of haunt, meaning a ghost or supernatural presence. Merriam-Webster traces the pronunciation into parts of the Carolinas, Georgia, and West Virginia, which gives us that broader southern and Appalachian geography before we ever arrive in the Low Country. The dictionary's current definition describes a haint as the soul of a dead person, particularly one understood as mischievous or mean, but regional folklore is considerably less tidy than a dictionary entry. Depending on where you are, who is telling the story, and when it was recorded, a haint might be a ghost, a troublesome spirit, a restless dead person, a frightening presence, or part of a much larger supernatural vocabulary. The word and the traditions that eventually gather around the word do not necessarily have the same history. The ordinary linguistic trail takes us back through haunt. The cultural trail spreads in several directions through Southern communities, including Black traditions, white Southern traditions, Appalachian folklore, and importantly, for where we are headed next, the Gullah Geechee communities of the coastal Southeast. Our research dossier makes the same caution very clearly. A belief recorded in Appalachia or in Arkansas cannot simply be carried over to the Sea Islands and presented as though everybody in the South meant the same thing by haint. So now we need to narrow the map. When we talk about the Low Country in this part of the conversation, we are talking broadly about the low-lying coastal region of South Carolina and Georgia, including coastal plains, marshes, waterways, and sea islands. This landscape is also part of the larger Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor, which stretches along the Atlantic coast from North Carolina through Florida. The Gullah Geechee people are descendants of Africans who were enslaved along this lower Atlantic coast, particularly on rice, indigo, and Sea Island cotton plantations. Communities developed under the particular conditions of coastal and island enslavement, maintaining and developing distinctive languages, foodways, music, art, spirituality, family traditions, and other forms of cultural life with strong West and Central African continuities. The Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor itself describes this as a living culture, shaped within those coastal communities rather than some vanished collection of plantation-era customs. And this is where we arrive at one of the most recognizable ghost stories in Southern architecture, Haint Blue. You have almost certainly seen it, even if you have never heard the name. The pale blue or blue-green, often painted on porch ceilings or sometimes used on doors, windows, shutters, and other exterior details of a house. Today, you can find shades marketed under the name Haint Blue in decorating magazines and paint collections, and the look has become so thoroughly absorbed into the visual vocabulary of the American South that plenty of people paint their porch ceilings blue without attaching anything supernatural at all. But there are also long-standing stories about blue being used protectively. One explanation says that a haint cannot cross water, and so blue painted around the vulnerable parts of a home confuse the spirit into believing that it has encountered water and cannot enter. Another says the blue resembles the sky, drawing or confusing the spirit upward instead of allowing it into the house. You will find both explanations repeated through Southern folklore and remembered family tradition, sometimes alongside one another. An Arkansas heritage account, for example, records both the water and sky explanations while also describing family memories of haints being unable to cross water. And this is where I need to resist one of the most common temptations in folklore writing, the urge to pick the version that feels the most ancient or the most elegant, the most complete, and then declare the mystery resolved, because it isn't. The water explanation is a story, and so is the sky explanation. That doesn't mean they are meaningless or false. Folklore is evidence of what people have believed, remembered, repeated, feared, taught their children, or used to explain a practice. Oral tradition is an extraordinarily important historical source, particularly for people whose lives were incompletely documented by institutions that were never especially concerned with preserving their voices. But an oral explanation and a chemical analysis of a paint layer answer different questions. A porch ceiling and the story told about that porch ceiling are related pieces of evidence, but they are not interchangeable. And this particular blue turns out to be a fantastic example of how easily those categories blur together. For years, one of the most popular versions of the Haint Blue story has gone something like this. Enslaved Gullah people in the Low Country made protective blue paint using indigo grown on plantations where they were enslaved, painted the doors, shutters, windows, frames, or ceilings of their homes, and used that blue to keep harmful spirits away. You can immediately see why that story took root. Indigo sits at the center of colonial South Carolina's history. The indigo economy was built through the forced labor of enslaved Black people. Gullah Geechee's spiritual and protective traditions are real. Blue architectural finishes are real. Stories linking blue to protection against taints are real. The difficulty comes when all of these true things get arranged into a single, very clean chain of cause and effect without enough evidence to support every step in between. And this is where somebody did the thing that I love most. They tested the paint. In 2025, historic preservation researcher Sophie Haas completed a study called The Color of Spirits, investigating Haint Blue in the American Low Country. She went looking specifically at the history, mythology, and material composition of what we now call Haint Blue. And one of the things her research found is that the history is considerably less well documented than its popularity would suggest. She found that Haint Blue itself did not become a widely recognizable term until the 20th century, particularly around the 1970s, and the original pigments identified in the historic samples she studied were synthetic ultramarine and Prussian blue, not indigo. Now, that does not demonstrate that nobody ever used indigo in a blue architectural coating. It does not demonstrate that blue was never used protectively by Gullah Geechee people. And it certainly does not allow us to take preservation science and hold it triumphantly over oral tradition like we have caught somebody telling a ghost story incorrectly. It tells us what those particular historic paint samples contained, and that forces us to make the larger story more precise. Because Haint Blue was never necessarily one standardized shade in the first place. We are talking about a range of blues and blue-greens on different buildings in different communities, painted at different times, sometimes repainted repeatedly over generations. To understand one particular blue surface, a conservator may have to look at the sequence of paint layers, identify pigments and binders, compare them with the age of the building, look at photographs and documents, and then put all of that material evidence into conversation with the people whose families actually lived there. There is a wonderful example of this at the Davenport House in Savannah. The house has an old blue painted attic space, and for a time, the interpretation around that paint connected it with the enslaved people who had lived and worked in the household and with the story of protective Haint Blue. It was an appealing interpretation because the blue was physically there. The cultural history existed in the surrounding region, and the pieces appeared to fit together. Then they examined the paint more closely. The blue turned out to be a later layer, probably dating from the 1890s or afterward, rather than the period of enslavement the museum had hoped it represented. The conservator also concluded the paint was commercially available rather than a homemade indigo mixture. The Historic Savannah Foundation did something I wish happened more often in public history. They changed the story when the evidence changed. And there is another complication in that same investigation that I think matters just as much. Louise Miller Cohen, who founded the Gullah Museum of Hilton Head Island and grew up in a Gullah family there, said that Haint Blue was never something her own family talked about. She specifically pushed back against the assumption that every Gullah household painted houses blue to ward away spirits. That does not invalidate families who do remember the tradition. It tells us that Gullah Geechee culture, like every living culture on Earth, contains variation. There was never a single monolithic Southern culture acting as a committee of ancestors distributing the official rules for ghost-repelling porch paint. Families differ, and even within a single family, the memory of a practice can shift depending on who is telling the story. Communities preserve different versions of the same belief, sometimes emphasizing protection, sometimes fear, sometimes simple habit without any supernatural framing at all. Islands differ in how isolation and trade shape what is remembered and what is lost, and what gets absorbed into something new. Practices move as people move, as homes are built, rebuilt, and reinterpreted over time. Stories move with them, sometimes intact, sometimes fragmented, and sometimes stitched back together later by someone trying to make sense of what remains. Some things are remembered intensely in one place and scarcely at all 20 miles away. And then, almost quietly at first, and then all at once, tourism arrives, preservation arrives, interior design arrives, paint companies arrive with names and swatches and marketing language, magazines arrive to photograph it, Pinterest arrives to flatten into an aesthetic mood board, and contemporary witchcraft arrives too, each one layering its own interpretation over something that was never originally meant to be so widely seen, so neatly packaged, or so consistently explained. And suddenly, something that may once have been a locally specific protective practice attached to particular families, buildings, beliefs, and circumstances just becomes Southern aesthetic. The blue survives, and the word survives, and the ghost story survives, but the relationship between them keeps changing. And I want to be clear that I'm not standing outside of that process pointing at everybody else, because there's literally a stick of incense in this month's box called Creeping Hate. I too am participating in the modern cultural life of this word. For me, that makes provenance more important, not less. If we are going to pick up old words, symbols, practices, ingredients, stories, or aesthetics and carry them into contemporary witchcraft, then we should be willing to learn what we are touching. We can know whose traditions we are talking about, distinguish what is documented from what has been repeated, and leave uncertainty where uncertainty belongs. We don't have to strip all the ghost out of history in order to take history seriously. Sometimes the uncertainty part is what makes the story worth telling. And maybe this is where folklore begins to tell us something important about roots. A story can begin under one set of conditions and continue long after those conditions change. It can move from protection into habit, from habit into tradition, from tradition into decoration, and from decoration back into spiritual practice again. Along the way, it can gather new explanations, lose old ones, cross communities, become commercialized, become reclaimed, become misunderstood, and still retain pieces of whatever came before. So when folklore travels, what exactly survives? Is it the practice itself, still intact and recognizable, passed hand to hand like something fragile and necessary? Or is it the meaning, whatever that once was, held carefully in the mind of the next person, even as the original context begins to blur at the edges? Or maybe it is only a memory of the meaning, already softened, already half reconstructed, the way a story changes slightly every time it is told in a different room, under a different roof, by a different voice. Sometimes what survives is not the thing at all, but the explanation that grew up around the thing later. The story we tell to justify why the thing was done in the first place, even if that explanation was never the original reason. And sometimes, especially in the modern world, what survives is something even further removed, a commercial approximation of the whole thing. A version flattened just enough to be sold, packaged, repeated, made legible to people who were never meant to inherit it in the first place. The truth is, it is probably all of these at once, depending on where you are standing and how far back you are willing to look. Folklore does not move in straight lines. It does not preserve itself like a specimen in glass. It grows roots of its own, tangled, adaptive, reaching into whatever soil is available even when that soil has changed completely from the one it first emerged in. And once a story has rooted itself deeply enough, something strange begins to happen. The conditions that first produced it can disappear almost entirely. And yet the story does not. It keeps going anyway. It keeps adapting anyway. It keeps finding new ways to make itself necessary. Which means we have finally reached the part of this field guide where roots are no longer enough. We can trace beginnings, yes. We can map origins, follow threads backwards into the dark. Name the places where the things first took hold. But that is not the whole work. Because now we have to ask what it means when something continues after its origin has faded. When a story outlives the world that made it and begins to belong instead to all of the worlds that come after. We know how things began. Now we need to talk about what happens when they remain. Inheritance asks something more complicated of us than gratitude. Plenty of beautiful things survive. So do terrible ideas, prejudices that have had enough time to disguise themselves as common sense, family patterns nobody quite knows how to name, and ways of protecting one another that depend quietly on somebody else remaining unheard. We inherit obligations that made sense within lives very different from our own, and stories repeated so faithfully that eventually the repetition itself begins to feel like loyalty. Questioning them can feel less like examining an old story and more like betraying the person who first placed it in your hands, which is part of what makes inheritance so difficult. A thing can be both precious and heavy. It can connect us to people we love while asking something of us we are no longer willing, or perhaps no longer able, to give. There may be knowledge inside it worth keeping, even when the conditions surrounding that knowledge should not be preserved. A habit that genuinely helps somebody survive one life may be completely wrong for the life that came after it. And this is where I want to come back to rot. Although by now we know enough about decomposition that we do not need to follow another leaf all the way to the bottom of the swamp. We already know what happens there. Material remains, but its relationships change. What once belonged to a living tree can become food, habitat, sediment, dissolved carbon, or part of the chemistry that determines what happens around it next. None of that requires us to declare the original thing worthless, and none of it requires us to pretend that decomposition somehow improved its moral character. I think that gives us a much more useful way to approach inheritance. We do not have to turn every painful experience into a lesson before we are allowed to move forward from it. And we do not have to continue every inherited practice simply because there was a good reason for it. At the same time, understanding that something grew from pain does not automatically make the thing itself disposable. Sometimes what remains is a skill, a warning, a way of noticing danger, a piece of knowledge that is still useful even after the world around it has changed. So the question becomes less about whether something is good enough to keep or bad enough to throw away, and much more specific. What is this doing here now? What does its continued presence make possible? And what does it prevent? What is it protecting? Who benefits because it remains exactly as it is? And who keeps paying for that survival? If the conditions that created it have changed, what happens when we stop treating its persistence as inevitable? Chronological endings are not always functional ones. An experience may be over and still alter the choices we make years later. A warning handed down through a family may continue shaping people who never lived through the danger that created it. An old defense can remain useful in one circumstance and become destructive in another. Stories can organize whole families long after anyone remembers exactly where they began. Emotions do this too. They remain in circulation. They respond to what is happening now, but they also carry information gathered somewhere else. From the thing that happened last week or 10 years ago, from the boundary we did not know how to defend at the time, from the moment somebody harmed us and nobody named it, from the danger that passed or the one that never actually did. Which brings us to anger. Anger has a reputation for being obvious. It is hot, loud, physical. Even when we are very good at hiding it, the body tends to know it is there. Your jaw tightens and your heart starts moving faster. Your thoughts begin arranging themselves around the offense, replaying the conversation, reconstructing the moment, finding the sentence you should have said 6 hours ago. And for all the ways we have been taught to distrust anger, suppress it, spiritualize it, glorify it, or turn it into some kind of personal empowerment brand, anger is doing something much more ordinary. It is responding to information. Sometimes that information is very clear. Somebody crossed a boundary, somebody hurt you, something unfair happened, and everybody in the room watched it happen. A person with more power used it badly. Somebody lied, manipulated, humiliated, threatened, exploited, or simply kept taking after they had already been told no. Anger can be extraordinarily good at noticing when something has gone wrong, especially when some quieter part of us has spent a long time trying to explain it away. There are moments when anger arrives almost as recognition, a sense of it settling in. This wasn't okay. Not something I should have had to absorb, and not something I deserved. Underneath that comes the sharper awareness. You knew better. You knew exactly what you were doing. Sometimes anger is the first emotion willing to say out loud what fear, grief, loyalty, politeness, dependence, or love made difficult to name. But anger also responds to fear, embarrassment, rejection, helplessness, uncertainty, jealousy, shame, exhaustion, old injuries, and threats that may be real, exaggerated, misunderstood, or remembered from somewhere else entirely. Which means the presence of anger tells us something important has happened inside of the system. It does not by itself tell us exactly what. Anger is information. Information still requires interpretation. Sometimes anger feels convincing. There is a particular clarity that can arrive with it when all the complicated parts of a situation suddenly seem to organize themselves around one clean conclusion. I am right, they are wrong, something should happen now. And sometimes that conclusion is accurate. Sometimes somebody really did behave terribly. Sometimes we have spent so much time trying to understand everyone else's motives, circumstances, childhoods, pressures and tensions, misunderstandings, and personal fucking journeys that anger is the thing that finally reminds us explanation does not erase impact. Understanding why somebody behaved badly does not require us to pretend they did not behave badly. Context matters, and so does responsibility. Those things can coexist. But the certainty of anger can also become seductive because certainty is easier to live inside than ambiguity. Anger can keep us moving when grief would stop us in our tracks. It can give shape to helplessness. It can provide somewhere to stand when everything else feels unstable. And if we remain there long enough, we can begin collecting evidence for the anger rather than using the anger as evidence that something deserves closer examination. That is where interpretation becomes important. What exactly is this anger pointing toward? Was a boundary crossed? And if so, which one? Was somebody harmed? Is something still unsafe? Did somebody evade responsibility, leaving the anger to carry a demand for acknowledgement that never came? Or am I responding not only to what happened, but to what it represents? Because those are sometimes very different things. A friend cancels plans, and somehow the emotional response belongs partly to everyone who has ever made you feel unimportant. Somebody questions a decision, and suddenly you are defending yourself against a person who has been dead for 15 years. A relatively ordinary disagreement finds an old bruise and presses directly into it. And now the present moment has become crowded with people who are not actually in the room. That does not make the anger fake. It means there may be more information inside it than the immediate situation can explain. And this is one of those places where our earlier question becomes useful again. Are the original conditions still there? Maybe they are. Sometimes the danger did not pass. The person may still be behaving badly. The institution may still be doing harm. And the boundary may still be crossed simply because nothing meaningful has ever forced it to stop. In those circumstances, anger may be responding quite accurately to the world as it currently exists. But sometimes the conditions have changed and the alarm remains sensitive to their shape. A defense learned under one set of circumstances can begin firing in another. Anger that once protected dignity can start protecting pride. Suspicion that once kept us safe can make innocence difficult to recognize. The refusal to be controlled can become refusal to tolerate disagreement. None of this requires us to distrust anger, but it does require us to listen more carefully. This is something I talk about when I teach curse work, because baneful magic makes the stakes unusually obvious. Before you decide that another person deserves restraint, disruption, exposure, misfortune, harm, or any other consequence you intend to deliberately bring into their life, you are making a judgment. And judgment made in anger is still judgment. That doesn't automatically make it wrong. There are circumstances in which anger is entirely appropriate, and circumstances in which consequence is appropriate too. But if we do not understand our own anger, our projections, our triggers, and the particular injuries we carry into a situation, it becomes very easy to mistake an emotional reaction for a moral verdict. Feeling wronged and having been wronged can overlap perfectly. They can also come apart. So, before we decide what anger gives us permission to do, I think we have to stay with it long enough to ask better questions. What happened? What evidence do I actually have? What part of this belongs to the present situation? And what arrived here with me? What am I afraid will happen if I do nothing? What would I need in order to feel safe? What would repair look like if repair is even possible? Do I want acknowledgement? Do I want the behavior to stop? Do I want distance, restitution, exposure, protection, an apology, a changed system, or a closed door? Or do I want them to hurt? And that's where the question changes. Because once anger has told us that something is wrong, we eventually have to decide what we believe should happen because of it. Not what would feel satisfying for 30 seconds. Not what anger can imagine. What do I actually want now? And beneath that, the considerably more dangerous question: what do I think they deserve? That question is where anger stops being only information and begins moving towards judgment. Because the moment we decide somebody deserves something from us, whether that is distance, protection, exposure, restraint, restitution, punishment, or harm, we are no longer only describing what happened. We are deciding what should happen next. There is an enormous amount of territory inside that decision, because the responses available to us are not morally interchangeable simply because they began with somebody doing something wrong. So before I decide what I am willing to do, I need something more useful than the question of whether I am justified in being angry. What outcome am I actually seeking? Protection and punishment are different requests. Stopping somebody from reaching you is different from making sure they regret having tried. Exposing behavior so that other people can make informed choices is different from humiliation for its own sake. And restitution is concerned with repairing or returning something in a way revenge may not be. Sometimes those desires overlap. There is no particular virtue in pretending otherwise. But if I am going to act on them, I should know which one I am feeding. I call my class Curses 101 because curse is the word everybody recognizes. Even people who have never stepped into a witch store in their life understand the basic cultural shape of a curse. But in my own teaching, curse is really the doorway into a much larger category of baneful workings, which can include harm, restraint, disruption, misfortune, leverage, binding, interference, and work that a practitioner understands as justice or consequence. And before the Witchcraft Webster's Dictionary Committee sends me a strongly worded letter, these categories are not universal. Different traditions use different words, and individual practitioners disagree about where a hex ends and a curse begins. In the Blackwater framework, I generally use curse for a more formalized ritual process, and hex for something quicker and more tactical. That distinction helps me teach the material, but it is not a law of nature. What matters considerably more to me is what the working is actually intended to do. And this is also where my ethics around curse work depart pretty sharply from one of the most common spiritual arguments against it. You will hear versions of the same warning everywhere. Don't direct harm because whatever you send into the world will eventually find its way back to you, usually with interest. I don't find that particularly convincing as an ethical system. If the only reason I refrain from hurting another person is because I am afraid some invisible accounting department will hurt me back, I have not actually decided that harming them would be wrong. I have decided that harming them might be bad for me. That is self preservation. Ethics ask a harder question. Was this mine to do? And I find it especially interesting how selectively metaphysical communities can apply this concern about harm. We can spiral into elaborate vigilance over whether a negative intention might taint our aura, disrupt our vibration, or offend some unseen moral accounting system, while barely pausing to ask whether that pretty crystal sitting on the altar was pulled out of the ground by literally slaves. Apparently, human exploitation somewhere upstream is a sourcing issue, but negative vibes are where we draw the ethical line. Anyway, this is why my framework begins somewhere much less mystical, mundane before magical. Most bad things that happen to us have ordinary causes. People lie because people lie. Jobs disappear because businesses fail or managers make decisions. Relationships implode because humans are complicated. Objects break because materials have physical properties, and sometimes a run of absolutely spectacular bullshit is exactly that. If the mundane explanation is stronger, more probable, and better supported, it wins. And the same rule applies to response. Magic should not become an excuse to avoid material action. If somebody is threatening you, make yourself safe. If somebody is stealing from you, document it. If a contract has been violated, figure out your actual legal options. If somebody is abusing institutional power, learn where that power comes from and what mechanisms exist to challenge it. You can light the candle too, but the candle doesn't file the paperwork. Once all of that is clear, baneful magic raises a much more interesting ethical problem because deliberately interfering with somebody else requires you to make a judgment. And that is what I call the weight of judgment. The moment I decide to bind, restrain, expose, disrupt, cross, hex, curse, or otherwise direct consequence towards another person, I am saying several things whether I admit them or not. I am saying that a line was crossed, that some response is warranted, and that this particular response falls within the range of things I am willing to be responsible for. I don't believe calling something justice work magically transforms it into justice any more than calling something self care makes every selfish decision healthy. Names do not absolve us from examining what we are doing. And this is where Judika Illes, a contemporary author and encyclopedist of magical practice, best known for her work cataloging folk magic, spellcraft, and cross cultural occult traditions, makes an argument that I find useful. When she discusses coercive and domination magic, she asks us to look at the material conditions surrounding the people who used it. A person with meaningful legal, economic, bodily, and social power has very different options from someone whose safety or survival is controlled by another person. That changes the question. It doesn't automatically make every coercive working ethical. It tells us to look at the power relationship before deciding what the act means. And we have historical evidence for exactly why that context matters. In African American conjure traditions under slavery, spiritual work could exist alongside very material attempts to survive people who legally claimed ownership of another person's body. The abolitionist writer William Wells Brown, in his 19th century slave narrative, My Southern Home, later wrote about an enslaved man known as Dinky who used conjure after an overseer threatened to whip him. Brown described protective objects on Dinky's body and a working directed against the overseer, and recorded that Dinky's reputation as a conjurer eventually made white people around him reluctant to assault him. At Arlington House, the historic plantation home overlooking the Potomac River that is now part of Arlington National Cemetery, archaeologists found a group of bottles beneath the floor of quarters occupied by an enslaved family, interpreted as part of a religious or magical spiritual bundle. The National Park Service is appropriately cautious about assigning one definite purpose to it, because archaeology cannot tell us exactly what somebody whispered over a bottle more than a century ago. But the possible functions include protection, self preservation, harmful work against others, and acts of defiance within enslavement. And I want to name that tradition specifically. These are examples from African American conjure and hoodoo histories under slavery. They are not evidence of some universal ancient category of dark magic, a term that is often used in ways that flatten and racialize very different traditions. And they certainly do not become generic swamp witchcraft because some of them happened in the American South. What they give us instead is something much more useful: context. A coercive working performed by somebody whose body, labor, movement, family, or survival is controlled by another person exist inside a radically different power relationship from somebody trying to dominate a casual romantic partner because they have not texted back quickly enough and they bought a spell from a witch on Etsy. The magical technique might be described with the same word. The ethical situation is nowhere near the same. And that brings me to what may be the most important thing I teach about curses in modern practice. The ability not to curse matters more than the ability to curse. Power does not prove itself by being exercised every time the opportunity appears. Restraint is part of the practice. I can believe somebody behaved badly without deciding I am entitled to destroy them. I can want accountability without requiring annihilation. I can decide that a person should experience consequences while still asking whether the consequence I am imagining bears any reasonable relationship to what actually happened. And sometimes restraint means doing nothing magical at all. Not because I'm afraid the universe is going to slap me 3 times harder. Because after looking at the situation clearly, I have decided that this particular response would be excessive, imprecise, or unnecessary, or likely to affect people who were never involved, or simply beneath the amount of energy I am willing to continue giving this situation. That is a very different kind of restraint. It is chosen rather than feared. So, when I am considering baneful work, I want to know what actually happened and what evidence I have for believing it happened. I want to know whether the harm is still occurring, whether there are mundane actions I have avoided because magic feels easier or more satisfying, and what outcome I am really trying to create. If the answer is protection, then why am I asking for punishment? If the answer is cessation, how much force is actually necessary to make the behavior stop? If I want exposure, is the goal for the truth to become visible or for the person to be publicly humiliated? If I want restitution, what would repair actually require? And if I want harm, then I need to be willing to say that plainly too, because dressing revenge in prettier spiritual language does not make it something else. Then there are the questions that become harder to answer while angry. Is this response proportionate? Who else could be caught inside it? Am I reacting to this person, or have I quietly placed three other people's faces behind theirs? Would I make the same judgment tomorrow? And if the outcome I am asking for actually happened, would I still believe it was mine to ask for? Those questions do not exist to talk us out of action. Sometimes, after answering every one of them, the answer is still yes. A line was crossed, the evidence is clear, the response is proportionate, and I know exactly what I am asking for. Understanding why I want consequence does not remove my responsibility for choosing it. The roots matter, and so does the anger that grew from them, the shape of the power involved, the history that made this moment possible, and the choices that were actually available to everyone inside it. All of that deserves examination because judgment made without context is careless. But context cannot make the decision for me. Eventually, there is still a moment where I have to choose what I am willing to do, what I am willing to ask for, and what responsibility I am willing to carry if I get exactly what I requested. And that is the weight of judgment. The difficult thing about making a choice is that it does not tidy the story behind you. What happened still happened. What I did still belongs to me, and what somebody else did still belongs to them. Understanding the conditions that produced any of it may give us context, compassion, anger, grief, or even a better explanation than the one we started with. But explanation eventually reaches the edge of what it can accomplish. There comes a point where we have traced the roots as far as the evidence will take us. Then we have to look at what is actually there. That is where I truly locate reckoning. In the refusal to keep dealing with a cleaner, simpler, more convenient version of what happened than the one we can actually support. And inconveniently, the accurate version often contains several truths at once. I can have made a mistake and you can still have hurt me. My mistake can have consequences without making your behavior acceptable. Someone can have very understandable reasons for becoming the person they became and still be responsible for what that person does. Anger can be justified while a particular thing done in anger is not. And the consequence can be appropriate without requiring us to destroy somebody in order to prove that what they did mattered. That complexity does not weaken accountability. It makes accountability more precise. Once we stop requiring one person to be entirely innocent before another can be wrong, we can finally ask responsibility to stay where it actually belongs. There may be something I need to repair because I damaged it. An apology I owe. A decision whose consequences are mine, even if I made it under pressure. There may also be harm done to me that I do not have to minimize in order to take responsibility for my own part of the story. Understanding somebody else's wounds does not transfer responsibility for their choices onto me, any more than being wounded myself makes every choice I make afterward somebody else's fault. And once we can see that clearly, consequence becomes much more interesting than punishment. What follows may be repair, because some damage can actually be repaired, or a boundary that finally has enough structure behind it to mean something. It may be the truth being said plainly after years in which silence made life easier for everyone except the person carrying it. Or restitution, distance, exposure, protection, or finally allowing someone to experience a consequence they have been insulated from for far too long. Sometimes nothing needs to be destroyed at all. Something simply needs to stop being fed. The swamp has been doing this the entire time. The cicadas are still being completely unreasonable. The air is still wet enough to cling to your skin. The water is still dark with tannins and dissolved pieces of the forest around it. And beneath the surface, there is still an impossible amount of activity. Things dying, things feeding, things breaking apart, things remembering, things remaining. None of it became simpler because we understood it better. Understanding why the water is dark doesn't make it clear. The cypress doesn't explain itself in straight lines just because we have named its shape. A story does not stay still once we know its origin, and a survival strategy does not earn permanence simply because it once kept someone alive. What understanding gives us is the chance to see what we are actually dealing with. And from there, we can decide what deserves to continue. There are inheritances worth protecting, warnings worth remembering, skills that grew under terrible conditions and remain genuinely useful, stories that deserve to be carried forward, and people whose hands we can still feel in the things they left behind. Keeping what mattered does not require keeping everything around it intact. A story can be remembered without being reenacted. Knowledge can survive even when the conditions that produced it should not. We can love the person who handed something to us and still change what happens when it reaches our hands. Because allowing a thing to end does not erase the fact that it once mattered. And by now, after spending all this time in the dark water, we know something about endings. The material remains, changing relationships as it becomes available to something else, while pieces of it continue moving through the system long after the original form is gone. Which is why I think we finally earned this. You do not have to preserve the corpse to keep the nutrients. Something may have mattered enormously. It may have protected you once, shaped the person you became, connected you to people you love, or carried knowledge that was absolutely necessary in the world where you first received it. Its history matters, and its survival tells us something. But neither one answers the question of what its continued presence is doing now. So maybe these are the questions I want to leave sitting here in the dark water without cleaning them up into answers. What are your roots still feeding? What should you let rot? And what needs to be reckoned with? Thank you for joining me for another trip into my little corner of history, folklore, ecology, and magic that somehow always ends up becoming much bigger questions than I thought I was asking when I started. If you're listening along with this month's Just Add Magic box, I hope you spend some time with the field guide, your specimens, and those little empty jars. And I hope you let yourself be curious about what you find before you worry too much about deciding what it means. As always, thank you for listening, for sharing the show, and for continuing to make the inner circle such a thoughtful and wonderfully weird little community. If you enjoyed this episode, sending it to somebody else who might happily follow us into a swamp is one of the best ways you can support the podcast. And ratings and reviews help more than you probably realize. You can find Blackwater Apothecary, the Just Add Magic subscription, and all of the other things I'm making through the usual places. I'll be back next month with another box, another story, and inevitably another research rabbit hole that got significantly more complicated than I expected. Until then, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and thank you for coming into the swamp with me.